Hey there guys, and welcome back. On this week's show, I'm going to be showing you guys the process I'm going to go through to duplicate this Adirondack chair arm. I know. What kind of a stupid show idea is this? Well, believe it or not, guys, more of you are going to come across this throughout your woodworking careers or your woodworking hobby life or whatever you want to call it. This is the arm off of an Adirondack chair that we've had, and there's nothing wrong with the chair. The problem is that the arm is rotted out. It sees a lot of weather exposure and it's had its day. So why throw it out? We're going to replace this arm, and what we need to do is duplicate it. And some of you may look at that chair and think, I'm just going to scrap it. But if you knew the process of how you could duplicate the part or parts that need to be replaced, you could salvage that chair that you like so much and give it a whole new look and some new sturdy pieces. So let's get into it, and I'm going to show you how I'm going to go about duplicating this arm. So where do we start? Well, we start is by looking at the original piece and determining what stock we need to replace it. And I've looked at this particular piece, and I know I'm going to need a piece of stock that's 3/4 of an inch thick. Now, I determined that by calipers, but of course if you don't have calipers, you can just give a measurement across the side of the wood. So we've got the thickness, and I've shown you how to go about measuring for that. And now we want the width, or the thickest part, or the meatiest part of the board. So we know what size or what width of stock we need. And what I've done is I've measured here, and this is 6 3/8 of an inch. And we've got here, 6 1/4. So there's obviously a bit of a taper here, but that's okay. We're going to incorporate all of that. But it looks to be that the widest part of this board is 6 3/8 of an inch. So there's a measurement that we're going to need. So of course, write it down. So 6 3/8. Now what about the length? Now obviously we can trim this after, but the length that we're going to be looking at is 30 inches. It's actually less than 30 inches, but for this particular case, we're going to need a rough stock of 6 3/8 by 30 inches by 3/4 of an inch thick. And just like last week, you can break your pencil too if you want. The other thing that we need to consider here is that in this particular armrest for this chair, there's a cup holder. There's a ringed cup holder right here. I'll just give you a view of that. And you can see somebody's tried to repair this already with some kind of an epoxy or what have you, and it's kind of gummed up, but that's okay. It's not going to affect us. But we're going to need a bit to drill that out. And for my liking, I'd like for it to be a Forstner bit. However, this is a 3.5 inch diameter hole. I don't know if I have a 3.5 inch diameter Forstner bit, but I'm going to have to check into that. The other thing you're going to need to consider here is that routed profile that I spoke about earlier, and we're going to have to find a router bit in my collection that will come close to duplicating that. I'm not the original constructor of this chair, so I don't have the original equipment that it took to build it. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to start with a piece of basically pine. That will work just fine for this project. So we're going to take that piece of 3/4 inch pine, and we're going to head over to the table saw. Our next step here is that we've already established our width of 6 3/8. So I've set my fence here at 6 3/8, and we're going to place that cleaned up edge that we just did against the fence, and we're going to run it through, and we're going to rip a board at 6 3/8. The next step in our duplication of this piece is you want to pick an area or an edge of reference. And what I mean by that is, for this particular armrest, we have this long flat edge. And that's the area that I want to line up with the edge of this pine board to give me my edge of reference. This is where everything is going to line up towards. So I'm going to line up the board perfectly flush with this edge, and quite simply now I'm just going to trace it. So you want to make sure that you get a good clean line all the way around. So go ahead and trace your piece and we'll go from there. At this point in time, we have our new armrest traced onto our board. Now, there's a lot of different methods to duplicate this particular armrest. We could have rough cut it now and go around and clean it up that way with a flush trim bit. But what if you don't have a flush trim bit? Well, then you're kind of euchred for that method. We could run this through the bandsaw and cut the profiles, being careful to stay exactly on the lines, and that's perfectly acceptable as well. Use a jigsaw, cut it out, being as careful as you can, finish it off by sanding. But for me, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this main board over to the table saw, and I'm going to lop off the excess material, and I'm pretty sure you saw this one coming. I'm going to take it onto the Excalibur, the scroll saw, and I'm going to take a crack at it with that puppy, and we're going to go around, and I'm just going to cut just outside of the lines. And I'm going to explain about that in just a bit once I finish cutting it out. Well, I'm not really a fan of standing when I scroll, but with a piece that's this size, sometimes you really don't have a choice. Pine being a softer wood, you don't really need an aggressive blade to cut it. And in this particular instance, I've got a number 7 reverse tooth blade in here. That's just aggressive enough that it's going to do a good job for us. So, as I said in the last segment, I want to cut just outside the lines. And the reason for that is that on a piece this size, it's very easy to kind of slip and go inside your lines. And we're looking for a duplication of the original here. We're not looking to do our own artistic rendition. So what we're going to do here is we're going to cut it just outside the lines, maybe a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch, and then once we're done that, we're going to take it over to the disc sander and we're going to clean it up, and on the inside curves we're going to go to the oscillating drum and we're going to clean it all up and bring it up to the line and make it all look just like the original did. And here we are with a very poorly and very roughly cut duplicate of this armrest. Now, I could have made this way better, but I didn't, and the reason that I didn't bother is I want to show you guys that even if you're not the best at following the lines, by cutting to the outside we can correct this with the sander. So now that I've got this cut rough, we're going to take it over, and I'm going to use the disc sander and go along all these outside curves, and we're going to clean this up. Now guys, this is a messy process, so I just want to stress here that if you're going to use a disc sander, in my case it's a 12-inch, you want to make sure that you got some dust collection going, and don't forget your PPE or your personal protective equipment, and in this case a good quality dust mask will go a long way to keeping the dust out of your lungs. One thing I'd like to point out and remind you guys about, you probably haven't heard me say it in a while, but before you start your sanding, you want to check with a trusted square that your table is square to your disc. And you know what? I can see that mine is out ever so slightly, but enough to bother me. So I'm going to make adjustments to this, and then we're going to go ahead and sand that armrest. Don't forget your PPE. We've got all of our outside curves and our straight sections sanded right to the line using the disc sander, and I've compared it to the original, and I'll show you after that it's right on the money. It looks really great, but really difficult to do an inside curve with a disc. It gouges, it just doesn't work. So what I've got here is an oscillating drum sander, and I have a belt attachment in it. You can use just say a 2-inch drum, that would work just the same, because as you're going to see as I sand this, I'm only going to be using this wide end of the drum on this side. So at this point what we're going to do is I'm going to be sanding this inside curve here, and at this point what you could do if you wanted, and we could have done it before too, is we could have taped our original onto here and used a flush trim bit with a guide bearing in the router. And sure, if you got one of those, that's a great way to do it, and it's really quick. But I'm going to show you how to do that on another show. But for today, we're going to go on the premise that you guys don't have that special bit. So we're going to go ahead with the sander here, and we're going to do the inside curve. So what we've got now is, with some careful sanding and cutting just outside the lines with a scroll saw and both the disc and the oscillating drum, we have a perfect copy of the profile of this arm, and it looks great. It's right on the money, and it's going to look great on the chair, but we're not done. First step we're going to take now in this process is we're going to take an oscillating disc sander, and I'm going to go over this with about 120 grit and just take all the rough edges off of it and get it nice and clean, and then we're going to move on to doing this little cup holder recess. The surface sanding is done, and as you can see here, the profiles are looking great. The next thing that we want to do is we want to duplicate this cup holder, and it's 3.5 inches in diameter. I really don't have anything that size to cut that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do some marking on this board, and the first thing I'm going to do is lay our original on top. I'm going to mark out our center hole here, and then from there I'm going to use a compass and draw out this center, or this cup holder hole. And I'm going to use a flush trim, or sorry, a trim router with a 1/4 inch straight bit, and I'm just going to route it by hand. set the depth to whatever I want it to duplicate this hole, and with some careful maneuvering of the trim router, I should be able to get a nice even circle all the way around to duplicate this particular cup holder. But first step would be to drill this center hole. And we have the hole there marked, and now with our compass set up with a 3.5 inch diameter circle, we're going to just mark out where it is that we want to be routing. You want to make sure it's a good solid line, because you're going to be following this with the the straight bit using your trim router. But the first step, of course, now that we have this drawn out, I don't know if you could see that there. Sorry about the sunlight coming in. But we're going to drill that center hole, and then I'm going to route for the cup holder itself. I've gone ahead and drilled out the drainage hole here, which is a 1/2 inch hole, and I have my circle marked. I have a 1/4 inch straight bit in my trim router. And what I'm going to do now is just go around the edges and carefully route out this recess. Setting the depth of this bit couldn't have been easier, because all I did was sat my base of my router down on the original and then lowered the bit down until it was touching in this recess. So we're going to go ahead now and route that, and you're probably tired of hearing me say it, but again guys, don't forget your PPE, in this case safety glasses and hearing protection. Well, I've got the routing done, and it was all done by hand here, and you know what, I think it turned out pretty decent. So I'm going to run the oscillating sander over the top of this again, and I'm going to just do some hand sanding in here to clean up this area. I went through my router bits and I was able to find the proper profile that I need in order to do that top decorative edge that they've got on the original arm. The problem was that it had a much smaller guide bearing on it, and that guide bearing made that profile too deep, and I really didn't want to use the fence, so all I did was put a larger guide bearing onto the bit, and that brought it out just enough to duplicate the profile that we've got there. So I'm going to go over and set up the router table, and I'm going to route that top profile to match the original arm. There you have it. A little bit of hand sanding after it was done to clean up the profile a little bit of the router bit, and we've got a replacement arm for the chair. Let me just show you here. We've got this one here, which is kind of old and it's had its day, and then we've got the new one with the new profile and the new cup holder, and these profiles are right on the money. They're exact. And it wasn't done by any kind of machine. It was done with some careful sanding and some careful cutting. There are some of you that may be wondering what the point of today's video is, because you don't have this chair and you have no use for this arm. Today's video was to show you that if you have something that needs repairing, you don't necessarily have to throw it out, and with some careful thought processes you can very easily replace the part that's worn and fix a chair that you enjoy. So with that being said, the purpose of the video was to show you different methods of being able to achieve that final replacement piece. Just a few more techniques to add to your arsenal of woodworking. So guys, I want to thank you again for watching. I hope some of you enjoyed this week's show, and I'm going to see you again next week with yet another woodworking video.